欢迎收看《白宫意见》，我是张经义。那这次呢，我因为采访民主党大会来到了芝加哥。那在芝加哥呢，我要为大家独家专访到国际政治学大师，也是多次精准预测国际大事件，甚至是看清国际政治本质的芝加哥大学教授米尔斯海默。Thank you very much, Professor Schmidsheimer. Thank you for let us do the interview at your home in Chicago.
My pleasure.
So we used to have two the most senior presidential candidates in the U.S. history, and now 4 years ago, Donald Trump was, according to a poll, the least popular president in the U.S. history, and 1 year ago, Kamala Harris was according to a poll, the least popular vice president in the U.S. history. So now we have the two least popular presidential candidates in the U.S. history, in a sense. So what does this say about the U.S. politics nowadays?
I think it's quite clear that with regard to both Biden and Trump, the American public did not want either one of them to be running for president. And with regard to Kamala Harris, not only was she a wildly unpopular vice president, but most people, when you ask them, will tell you that she's not terribly well qualified to be president. When she ran for president, she did not get a single delegate, and nobody thought it was possible that she would ever become president of the United States, except if Joe Biden had died in office. So basically what we have here are three candidates who are highly unattractive to the public. They're not seen as the kind of heavyweights that you would expect to lead the United States, especially in these complicated times. I think all of this tells you that the American political system is broken, that there's a fundamental problem here, that any system that produces candidates like Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Kamala Harris is in serious trouble.
Why is this happening?
It's very hard to say. The fact is that there's a great deal of dissatisfaction in this country, and that dissatisfaction has manifested itself in the rise of Donald Trump and also the rise of Bernie Sanders. You want to remember that in 2016, Bernie Sanders would have defeated Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries if the Democratic Party had allowed the process to play itself out. The senior Democratic leaders intervened and made sure that Hillary beat Bernie Sanders. And basically the same thing happened again in 2020. Sanders was on his way to defeating Biden, and the elders in the Democratic Party intervened to make sure that Sanders didn't win. So what I'm saying here is the fact that Trump was the presidential candidate for the Republicans in 2016, 2020, and 2024, despite the fact that there was a huge amount of opposition to him inside the Republican Party, tells you that there is great dissatisfaction in the land. And there's also lots of reason to think that Bernie Sanders' excellent showing in both 2016 and 2020 tells you that there's deep-seated dissatisfaction in the land. So what's happened here is that the American political system is not working well for lots of people in the body politic, and therefore people like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are doing very well. But nevertheless, the system is kind of rigged. So instead of Sanders winning in 2016 or 2020, you got Joe Biden. And Biden is was seen as a stopgap measure. But he decided instead of just being president for 4 years, he wanted to be president for 8 years. And that was not possible because it's quite clear that his mental faculties have deteriorated to the point where he's not capable of being president for another 4 years. It's not clear he's going to be able to make it all the way to the end of his first term in January 2025. But nevertheless, he was protected by his inner circle. And if it hadn't been for that catastrophic debate, he may be running for president right now, and he might have even been elected in November. And again, this tells you that there's something wrong.
But the issue is that we know there are apparently better candidates among this 300 million population than the three. So can this system produce better or best candidates in the future?
Who knows? For it to produce better candidates, the system has to be fixed. And the people who are getting elected, the people who come into power, have no incentive to fix the system because the system has put them in power. So it's not clear whether the American political system, which many people believe, me included, is broken, can be fixed in the foreseeable future. Most people argue that if you have a broken system, the only thing that leads to it being fixed is a major crisis, a depression, a war, or what have you. But hopefully we won't have a depression or a war. But if we don't have one of those things, then the system is not likely to be fixed.
We heard Kamala Harris gave her policy on Ukraine, and also we know the attitude of Donald Trump towards Ukraine. So how will this election change the fate of Ukraine?
Well, I think if you listen to Kamala Harris's speech at the Democratic National Convention, it's clear that from her perspective, nothing is going to change on Ukraine, that she is going to maintain the status quo. She's going to do towards Ukraine what Joe Biden has done in his 4 years in the White House. Trump is a different matter. Trump has said that he wants to fundamentally alter U.S. policy toward Ukraine. It's very important to understand that Trump is not talking about changing U.S. policy toward China. And he's not talking about changing U.S. policy toward the Middle East. And here we're talking about with regard to Israel. The one place where Trump is talking about changing American policy in a fundamental way is Ukraine. And in that regard, he differs substantially from Kamala Harris. The question you have to ask yourself is, do you think that Trump can deliver on his promise? Do you think that Trump can come into the White House and in effect settle the Ukrainian war and improve relations with the Russians, and in particular improve relations with Putin? Trump believes he can do that. In fact, Trump has said that he will solve the Ukraine problem if he's elected in November before he moves into the White House. I actually do not believe that Trump will be able to shut down the Ukraine war. I think that Trump will end up maintaining the status quo in Ukraine. I think the only thing that will change the course of the war in Ukraine and the course of America's relationship with Ukraine is if Ukraine loses on the battlefield. I think what happens in the fight itself is what really matters here. But I think the idea that Trump can come in and work out a deal with Putin is not likely. And the principal reason for that is that Putin's demands are not ones that Trump could easily accept. You want to remember that Putin has made it clear in a speech on June 14th of this year that two conditions have to be met before he will even agree to call a ceasefire and start negotiations with Ukraine and with the West. These are two preconditions. One precondition is that Ukraine and the West have to formally agree that the 4 oblasts that Russia has now annexed are now and forever Russian territory. And of course, the same applies to Crimea. Furthermore, the Ukrainians and the Americans, here we're talking about the West, have to accept the fact that Ukraine cannot be in NATO. They have to declare that Ukraine will be a neutral state. These are the two preconditions that Trump has to agree to before Putin even agrees to negotiate. In his debate, in Trump's debate with Joe Biden, Trump was explicitly asked whether he would agree to those two preconditions, and he said no. Well, if he will not agree to those two preconditions, then there are going to be no negotiations and there's going to be no settlement. So what Trump has to do is he has to be willing to accept the fact that Ukraine cannot be in NATO. He has to accept the fact that those 4 oblasts that the Russians have annexed belong to Russia forever, and that the Crimea belongs to Russia forever. And that's just the starting point for negotiations. I find it hard to imagine, given how much Russophobia there is in the United States, that he would be able to get away with doing that.
But now let's talk about Kamala Harris' policy. She wants to continue Joe Biden's policy, but at the same time, we see multiple Republican congressmen. They don't want to support or put more money into Ukraine. So if Kamala Harris is elected, can she sustain this policy to give the blank check kind of to Ukraine?
Well, that remains to be seen. I mean, the key point that we can take away from her speech at the Democratic National Convention is that she will go to great lengths to continue to support Ukraine no matter what. Now, it is possible that the Republicans will make that impossible for her to do, that they will cut off aid. A lot depends here on the congressional elections in November. We focus on what is going to happen in the presidential election. Is Trump going to win? Is Harris going to win? But you want to remember, whether the Republicans or the Democrats end up controlling the Senate and the House of Representatives matters enormously. If the Democrats do well in the Senate elections and in the House elections, and they end up controlling both houses of Congress, then there's not much the Republicans can do to thwart Harris's interests or efforts to support Ukraine. But if the Republicans end up dominating one house or both houses, it'll be a different story. So we have to see what the political constellation of forces looks like in November before we can determine whether or not Harris will be able to execute the policy that she plans on employing towards Ukraine.
You talk about the only possibility that will change the whole situation is Ukraine lose the war. And when will this kind of situation happen from your point of view?
Well, the fact is that Ukraine is already losing the war. It's lost 4 oblasts, it's lost Crimea. And if you look at events on the battlefield, the Russians are winning on the battlefield. And they're winning on the battlefield because they have a great advantage in weaponry, especially artillery. They have a great advantage in manpower, and they have air superiority. So events on the battlefield now favor the Russians. And if the war continues, the Russians are likely to conquer even more territory than they now control. The Russians now control about 20% of Ukraine's territory. They'll end up conquering even more than that 20% if the war goes on. So at some point, the Ukrainians are going to say enough is enough. It's not clear, where that point is, but there is a point where the Ukrainians will say enough is enough, and they will go to the negotiating table, and the Russians will be the victors. It will not be a decisive victory. Russia is not going to defeat Ukraine the way it defeated Nazi Germany in World War II. You remember the Russians or the Soviets ended up in Berlin, and the Soviet Union decisively defeated Germany. That's not going to happen with regard to Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to be decisively defeated. It's going to end up as a dysfunctional rump state. But the fact is it's going to lose a huge slug of territory. And then there will be a frozen conflict. And where that point is in the future is hard to say. But I would argue it's not far off simply because the Ukrainian military is doing so badly on the battlefield, and there's so little hope that it can rescue the situation.
But they're going to the Kursk right now. They're assaulting the territory in Russia.
The offensive into Kursk is a disaster for the Ukrainians. Here in the West, it's portrayed as a great victory. The Ukrainians are said to be redressing the balance, and the momentum is now swinging in favor of Ukraine. This is an argument that bears no resemblance to reality. What's happening in Kursk is a disaster for Ukraine. First of all, the main battlefields are in eastern Ukraine. And the Russians are doing very well in those battles in eastern Ukraine. They were doing very well in those battles in eastern Ukraine before August 6th, which is the date that the Ukrainians invaded the Kursk area. Well, what happened is that the Ukrainians pulled some key fighting forces off the Eastern Front so that they could execute the Kursk offensive. So they weakened themselves on the critically important Eastern Front. So the Russians are now doing better in eastern Ukraine than they were before August 6th. Now, with regard to the Kursk offensive, the Ukrainians, as you know, have gone on the offensive. But anytime you go on the offensive, your troops and your armored vehicles are out in the open and they're moving, so they're exposed to enemy fire. And very importantly, the Ukrainians do not have air superiority. They do not have air cover. It's the Russians who have air superiority. So as the Ukrainian forces have attacked into the Kursk region, the Russians have used their air power, they have used drones, and they have used their great advantage in artillery to inflict massive casualties on the attacking Ukrainian forces. Some estimates are that the Russians are killing 2 times as many armored vehicles every day in the Kursk region than they are killing anywhere else on the battlefield. Furthermore, they have inflicted about 4,000 casualties out of the 10,000 troops that invaded Kursk on August 6th. So the fact that the Ukrainians are launching this offensive into Ukraine is causing them to suffer huge casualties. Then you ask yourself, well, the Russians must be suffering casualties too. But that's not the case. The Russians are suffering small numbers of casualties, not large numbers of casualties like the Ukrainians are. And why is that the case? Because there are actually remarkably few Russians in that area. The reason that the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk area was able to conquer so much territory was because there were no Russians there. It was not like they defeated the Russians in the process of conquering that territory. There were hardly any Russians there. So they easily rolled into the Kursk region. And it was, again, Russian air power, Russian drones, and Russian artillery that went to work on those attacking Ukrainian forces and caused all those casualties.
Let's turn to Gaza. How can this upcoming election change the situation, the disastrous, tragic situation in Gaza?
The upcoming election will have no effect on the war in Gaza. The United States will support Israel unconditionally, whether Kamala Harris is in the White House, Joe Biden is in the White House, or Donald Trump is in the White House. In the United States, we have this powerful lobby. It's called the Israel lobby. It has awesome power over policymakers, especially when it comes to making policy with regard to Israel. And no matter what Israel does in Gaza, or no matter what Israel does to the Palestinians, the United States will support it unconditionally. And there is nothing Kamala Harris has said or done to lead one to think that she will change our policy toward Israel and toward the Middle East in any meaningful way. And of course, Trump has made it clear that he's going to continue to support Israel no matter what. So regardless of what happens in November in the presidential election, and even in the congressional elections, U.S. policy toward Israel and towards Gaza is not going to change.
You just talk about Israel lobby, and we know that you published a well-known book also titled Israel Lobby several years ago. So are they as influential as before, or they're getting more influential to the U.S. politics?
I think the lobby is more influential in terms of its dealings with policymakers and politicians today than it was in 2006 when Steve Walton and I wrote the article, and 2007 when we wrote the book. It's more powerful in terms of its dealing with policymakers, politicians. To put it more generally, the lobby is more powerful at the elite level. At the public level, it's less influential today than it was when we wrote the article in the book. And there is much less enthusiastic support toward Israel and much more enthusiastic support of the Palestinians in the public today than there was back then. So what you have today is something of a disjuncture between the public and the elites on the subject of Israel. And you see this, by the way, reflected in the Democratic National Convention, right? The leaders of the Democratic Party made sure that no person who was sympathetic to the Palestinians, be that person a Palestinian, an Arab American, or just a progressive Democrat, that no person of that sort would be able to speak at the convention, right? Nevertheless, if you looked at what happened at the convention, if you looked at who was there, there were a huge number of people, mainly outside the convention, although some were inside the convention, who were deeply committed to supporting the Palestinians and badly wanted someone to get up before the convention and speak on behalf of the Palestinians, to criticize what was going on or what is going on in Gaza. But the Democratic Party elites would not allow that to happen. So what you see here is evidence of that disjuncture between what's happening at the elite level, where policymakers and politicians remain firmly committed to Israel because the Israel lobby gives them no choice. Whereas down here in the body politic, the tides are shifting, and there is much more criticism of Israel today than there was in the past.
So we're actually just out of DNC, and we saw what happened. The situation, we see a lot of base that are not satisfied with the Democratic Party's policy towards Gaza or Palestine. And some people are saying this Democratic Party are actually shooting themselves in their feet by supporting Israel because they will lose a lot of votes. And the idea is that people do have vote if they see things they don't like, they can put the pressure on the Democratic Party's nominee, who is Kamala Harris. So what happened right now?
2 points. One is people do have the right to vote, but the question is, do they have a meaningful choice here between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris when it comes to Israel and the genocide in Gaza? And the answer is they have no meaningful choice, because there's no difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on how the United States should deal with Israel. There's just no meaningful difference. So your vote really doesn't matter. My second point has to do with what you say about the Democratic Party. There is no question that the Democratic Party has a real problem. It has a large progressive wing that's filled with people who are super critical of Israel, who are well aware that a genocide is taking place and want a fundamental change at the top in the Democratic Party. At the same time, there are a large number of American Jews who are deeply committed to the Democratic Party, who want the Democrats to continue to support Israel unconditionally. The problem that Kamala Harris faces, and it's a problem that Joe Biden would have faced were he running, indeed it's a problem that any Democratic policymaker would face if he or she were running for president on the Democratic ticket, is that if you move to accommodate or to appease or to support the pro-Palestinian faction, you alienate those American Jews who are deeply committed to Israel. And if, on the other hand, you try to reassure American Jews who are in the Democratic Party that you will support Israel in the future, much the way you have in the past, you alienate basically the progressive wing of the party. And given that almost everybody expects the election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump to be very close, every vote matters. Right. And here you have a situation where Kamala Harris is in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Mm-hmm. And it could be the case, we don't know for sure how this will play itself out, but it could be the case that she will lose, and she will lose in large part because she has sided with the pro-Israel forces inside of the Democratic Party against the progressive wing or the pro-Palestinian side.
When we talk about, you say, Israel lobby is getting more influential right now. In the case of war in Gaza, how do they influence the U.S. politics this time? Why almost every politicians in the United States are just follow what they want?
Well, virtually every politician on Capitol Hill knows full well that the lobby will monitor carefully what their position is on Israel. And if they support Israel no matter what, they give Israel unequivocal support, and they need campaign contributions, the lobby will make sure that campaign contributions are funneled to them. If, on the other hand, they favor a policy that's critical of Israel or limits what Israel can do, let's say in Gaza, the lobby will put its gun sights on those politicians and go to great lengths to make sure they are defeated in the next election. So every politician on Capitol Hill understands full well that he or she has a deep-seated interest in supporting Israel no matter what, for purposes of his or her political survival. So that's very important. And then when you have individuals who run for president, those candidates, whether it's Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, they all understand full well that in the campaign, they have to say unequivocally that they support Israel, that they have a profound commitment to the Jewish state. And then once they're in office, if they begin to veer away from the policy line that the lobby faces, the lobby will put enormous pressure on them to get back in line and to become pro-Israel in the extreme once again. And the lobby has a very sophisticated playbook. This is a truly impressive operation. I mean, the institutions and the individuals who make up the lobby wield tremendous power, and they do it in very effective ways. So we can expect, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump not to veer far from the policy line that Joe Biden has taken since he moved into the White House, and certainly since October 7th.
You talk about these two parties, candidates, they actually have similar idea about supporting Israel. And also in the United States, most of the people, their attitude towards Russia is not very positive. And you talk about the foreign policy blob in this country. I covered the White House for 15 years. I can sense there's certain power that push U.S. foreign policy towards some direction, but I can't tell who are they, who are the blob exactly?
Well, I think when people talk about the blob, they're talking about the American foreign policy establishment writ large. We're talking about policymakers, politicians, people in the media, people in think tanks, people in academia who care greatly about international politics and in particular care about American foreign policy. And the reason that establishment is referred to as the blob, I believe, is because there's hardly any difference between Republicans and Democrats, with one notable exception that I'll get to in a moment. There's remarkably little difference between those Republicans in the foreign policy establishment and those Democrats in the foreign policy establishment. They tend to think in the same way about the United States. They all believe that we are the indispensable nation. We should be the most powerful state on the planet. They all think that we have a right and a responsibility to roam around the world and interfere in the politics of other countries on topics like Israel, on topics like China, and even on topics like Ukraine, for the most part. You see that there is a remarkable consensus. So the idea that these Republicans who do foreign policy and these Democrats who do foreign policy are at each other's throats, that they're mortal enemies, bears little resemblance to what's actually going on. It's kind of a seamless web. There's not much difference between the two parties. And that's why it's referred to as a blob. Excuse me. Now, the one exception to this is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is in favor of a different foreign policy. He's in favor of restraint. He doesn't view the United States as an indispensable nation. He's not interested in running all over the world, interfering in the politics of other countries. It's just not how he thinks about things. The question you have to ask yourself is whether or not you think Trump can beat the blob back. In other words, what I'm saying here is that when Donald Trump moves into the White House in 2017, in January of 2017, and he says quite explicitly that he's going to fundamentally alter American foreign policy, does he do that over the next 4 years? In the contest between Trump and the blob in his first term in office, who wins? It's perfectly clear that the blob won and that Trump was defeated. And by the way, before that, President Obama was elected on the platform that he was going to fundamentally alter American foreign policy. He was going to put an end to the forever wars. He was going to do nation building at home. By the time he was done with his 8 years in the White House, the blob had defeated him as well. So the blob, or the foreign policy establishment, or what's sometimes called the deep state, it defeated Obama, and it defeated Trump in his first term. Now, Trump, who's fully aware of this, says things are going to be different if I get elected this fall and I move into the White House in January of 2025. I learned my lesson. I'm going to bring in people who share my views, and we are going to defeat the blob. We are going to defeat the foreign policy establishment. If I had to bet a lot of money on who's going to win that fight after Trump moves into the White House, and of course we're assuming he wins the election, I would bet my money on the blob, not on Trump.
How does it happen? I mean, I travel with the White House to Finland for this Putin and Trump summit. I know Trump really trying to improve the relationship with Russia. And then also...
And he failed.
He failed. How do this blob influence him and that he cannot make his own decision as U.S. president?
Well, he's only one person, right? And as you know, inside the Beltway, there are lots of institutions and lots of powerful individuals who are committed to maintaining the status quo, who are committed to American exceptionalism, who are committed to American primacy, who are committed to the standing policies. And they are very sophisticated, very powerful, have a lot of experience, and any one president who tries to take them on is going to be outnumbered and is going to be at a significant disadvantage. And you want to remember, this is a very powerful consensus, right? Now, one could argue it's beginning to break down over Ukraine. Ukraine is the one issue where you see a crack in the edifice, right? Trump definitely and J.D. Vance definitely want to get out of Ukraine, and they both want to have better relations with Russia. And there are a number of people in the Republican Party who feel that way. But again, whether they ultimately prevail is an open question. It is possible that this time, if Trump is elected, he'll be able to beat back the blob. But again, I just wouldn't bet a lot of money on that.
Also, I'm curious. I covered Joe Biden while he was vice president, and he welcomed China's rise. And also, during his campaign in 2019, he said China is not going to eat Americans' lunch. But while he entered the White House, he totally changes policy to align with the blob's policy on China. How does this happen?
Well, I have a very simple explanation here. Joe Biden, as you know, when he was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and when he was the vice president under Barack Obama, was deeply committed to engagement with China. He wanted to have cooperative relations with China, and he was not interested in pivoting to Asia and containing China. Trump becomes president in 2017. He abandons engagement, and it is Trump who initiates a policy of containment towards China. Now, 4 years later, Trump is defeated by Biden, and that means that Biden, who had been an arch proponent of engagement and an opponent of containment, now has an opportunity, when he moves back in the White House, to go back to engagement and to jettison Trump's policy of containment. He does not do that. As you said, he does exactly the opposite. He doubles down on containment. I think you could make a good argument that Biden was tougher on China than Trump was in his 4 years. So the question you have to ask yourself is, why is that the case? Why didn't Biden go back to engagement? Why did he continue this policy of containment that Trump had initiated?
What's your collection here?
The truth is, this is a random sampling of my books.
Okay.
And what's happened over time is I have accumulated so many books that I've given up all hope of organizing them. So if we were to go upstairs to my study, you would see I have a whole slew of books up there. And if we were to go down to my office at the university, I have even more books down there. Furthermore, I have a home in Michigan that has a library that's filled with books as well. I have so many books, and they're so unorganized, and this, of course, describes this array of books. They're so unorganized that sometimes I can't find a book that I know I have, and therefore I have to order a new copy from Amazon.com, even though I know that somewhere, either here or upstairs or at my office or in Michigan, the book can be found. But I can't find it.
At least you're helping the economy.
I'm helping the economy, that's right.